Data binding is one of the strongest features that Vue.js has to offer. Essentially what this means is that a website user types some information into an input element, and then the Vue.js component responsible for the input will adjust itself accordingly. So here we are running our npm dev script, and now we want to add an input right in the middle of our main app file here. So let's just add it right here at the top, and we'll say input. The type should be number here. And one important part of data binding is the vModel directive. This is the primary way for achieving data binding in Vue.js. What we will need is a property here in our data object, and let's just put any old number, let's say 5 in here as our x value. Then we can say that the vModel should point to x, and that's going to link this input's value up with this data property. Let's save that and go over to our browser, and we'll see sure enough the input has the number 5 in there. This hasn't actually affected our point at all, even though it's hard to tell one way or another so far. What I can do is open up my console, and I'm using Firefox's Vue DevTools add-on. If you Google your browser and Vue.js DevTools, you'll probably find a similar add-on for your browser of choice. Once I'm in here, I can open up the app component, and I see that here are my point and my axis components. And we put the X property on the app component. So if we click there, sure enough, we'll see that there's our X. And if we change this value up and down, we'll see that sure enough the X changes. One thing I noticed right away is that our X went from an integer. Let me refresh here. Our X went from an integer to a string. So watch what happens closely when I hit the up arrow on my keyboard. The X changed to a string. One way we could control this is to go back to our vModel directive and say vModel.number, and that'll make sure that the value deriving from the input will always be a number. So let's save that. And if we click on our app component again, we have integer 5, and as we hit the up arrow again, we have integers each time. Now the next thing we want to do is make sure that our point will go back and forth along the number line as we change that input value. To do this, let's go back into our point component, and we'll recall that this right property here is what's going to determine the position of the point along our number line. And that brings up a question here. So our app component is somehow supposed to communicate the value of this X into our point component, so that here inside our point component, this value right here will change according to the value of X. To achieve this, let's go into our app component where we are putting the point component in place, and we're going to give what's called a prop or a property to our point component. So we do this using the colon syntax here, and we're saying that our property is going to be called X. Now before we put a value in here, let's go back into our point component, and we need to make it aware of the X property here by defining a props property on our point object. So we can say that the X property should have a type of number, and let's say that its default value should be 0. That seems to make sense. And now if we go back into our main app component, we can go ahead and give this prop a value. And the value we're going to give it, just to cut down on confusion, let's call it X value. And up here we'll change this to the same thing. And we'll change our data property to X value. And that's just for the sake of not naming things by the same name. And hopefully that makes it clearer that the point has a property called X, and the value that our parent component is passing in is called X value, and that's linked to the value of 5 down here. So that was a lot of changes. Let's go back to our browser and just inspect here in our Vue tools. And if we click on our app component first, we have x value 5, and our point has a prop called x with a value of 5. Great, and because of Vue data binding, if we change this input value, we'll see that our prop value on our point component changes, as does our x value on our main app component. So how do we get our point to move along with this value as the value changes? Well, we need to go back into our point container, and let's revisit how we were able to get the point in the last video to move back and forth. Recall that this CSS calculation is what controls the point's horizontal position left or right, and that if we change our 0 pixels to 10 pixels, then that should move the point 10 pixels in the right direction. Just to confirm that, let's put in an obvious value that will make a visible change, like say 250 pixels. Save that, go back to our browser, and yeah, it looks like it's been moved. So what we need is for this value to somehow be determined by our prop value here. And the way I'm going to do that is go up to my template and use a Vue style binding directive. So I make a new object in here and I say that the right property should be given by, let's just say, a new variable that we're going to call xCSS. Now this variable is essentially going to represent this expression right here. And this is a good example of what are called computed properties in Vue. Since our expression takes a value like 250 and then converts it into a CSS calc expression, we're going to let Vue handle that computation for us by creating an object of computed properties, and we're going to make one with the same name that we used in our style binding up here. And what we want to have in there is going to be exactly this calculation. So I'm going to cut that to my clipboard, remove the right rule completely from my style area, and paste it in here as the return value for this computed property. And if we did this correctly, we should be able to go back to our browser, refresh just to be safe, and see that the point is still there and has not really been changed at all. Good, so our computed property is working and it didn't break anything. And now to hone in on this a little bit more, I'm going to use something called a string literal, which will allow me to insert a value here. And this is sort of just a fancy replacement for string concatenation. What I can do is insert the prop value here. So if I say this.x, that's going to refer to our prop value, which is being passed in by the parent component. And now our point's position should be bound to the input element in the browser. So let's save this and jump back over. And there we go. We have it moving left and right based on the input value that we put in there. I'm using the up and down arrows here on my keyboard to change this. You could also just type in a number like 78 if you wanted to, or -23, and you'll see that the point moves to the corresponding spot on the number line. And just to clarify what's happening with our point's xCSS property, let's watch that as we move this up and down a little bit, and this has the effect of 50% plus 15 pixels, and if we put a positive value in there, it's going to calculate 50% minus the positive value. One thing that we can definitely improve is if we put the number 0 here. In theory, this would be exactly at the center of our number line, but there's really no way for us to ensure that or measure it at this time. So what we're going to do is add a tick mark where x equals 0, and we'll see how closely our point lines up with that tick mark. Now the concept of a tick mark to me sounds like a prime candidate for a new component for us. So let's go ahead and make a new file called tickmark.vue, and this will be in our main source folder. So as always, we'll start with our one parent div, which is necessary for Vue to work correctly. We'll give this a class of tickmark dash container to fit in with our pattern for our other components. And we'll say that the name should be tickmark. We don't really care too much about our data, so we're just going to remove that for now. And in the style part of our component, we're going to use the same technique that we've used in our other components to make sure that this gets centered in the middle of the screen. So we'll give it a position of absolute and our other properties that will make this work like before. Okay, and for our tick mark, we want to say that it has a height of 20 pixels and a width of 0, which might sound counterintuitive. But the way that we're going to achieve the 1 pixel width for our tick mark is to give it a border. And in this case, let's just use border left. And we'll say that it should be 1 pixel solid black. Okay, great. And now we need to import this in one of our parent components. In my opinion, it makes a lot of sense for the tick mark to be part of the axis itself, since essentially it's just going to be a label for the axis that gives us a visual cue about where 0 is. So let's enter into our axis component. We're going to need to import tick mark from current folder tickmark.vue. And I'm noticing that we never gave this component a name, so let's go ahead and do that. And then we'll tell it that it needs to look for the tickmark component. And finally, we'll just insert the tickmark HTML element here inside of our main axis container. So let's go ahead and see how that looks. Okay, we did get our tickmark here. But we'll notice that even though the point is supposed to be at 0, which is dead center, it doesn't fall square on the tick mark like we would expect it to. It turns out that the width of the point itself is a factor that needs to be taken into account with our calculation. So let's start adding numbers here and see where we get to when it starts to look about right. Okay, so 2 looks pretty good. 3 looks too far. And that tells us that the number should be somewhere between 2 and 3. If you recall, our point was 5 pixels wide, so this makes sense that the number would be somewhere around half of that amount. And just to demonstrate, if we enter 0 in for the input, it looks like the right side of the point is right at 0. And if we put the number 5 into the input, it looks like the left side of the point is right at 0. So how about we try to just split the difference and say that x should be 2.5. And sure enough, that looks like it puts the point exactly where it should be. In adjusting our calculation then, it makes sense if we want the value 0 to correspond to negative 2.5 pixels, that we should adjust the computed property in our point component and account for this small adjustment. So we'll go into our calculated statement and say minus 5 pixels divided by 2. Admittedly, this isn't great to have the value 5 hard-coded in here. It should be a little more abstract than that to allow our point to be bigger or smaller. But for now, we're going to settle on a to-do item, and we'll just make a note for ourselves to make the 5 pixel width adjustable. And before we go back to our browser, let's open back up our main app component and just change this original x value back to 0 so that the point starts in the middle. And if we revisit our browser now, we'll see that there we go. We have a point right in the middle on the tick mark, and we can move it back and forth and everything's working. If you remember from a previous video though, we did use a scaling factor of 10 in order to make the point move a little faster because it is going pretty slow there. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go back into our point CSS calculation, and we're just going to take the x value and multiply it by a scale of 10. And again, this isn't something that should ultimately be hard-coded, so we're going to add that to our to-do. So we'll want to come back and abstract both of those numbers out of this calculation at some point. For the time being though, let's go back into our browser and make sure that that's working okay. And yeah, it looks like the point's moving back and forth at a pretty good rate there. If we really wanted to test this out and make sure it was doing what we expect, we'd probably do another test, maybe say 25. And sure enough, this makes the point move even faster. So now that we have a number line, a point, and a tick mark, and we're binding some data from a user input to the point to make it move along the number line, let's go ahead and add in a second axis into our system so that our point can move in more than just one dimension.